I call the honourable member Carmel Cepoloni.
Mr Speaker, I'd like to start just by saying that I have spent some time working in the tertiary sector. I spent about 5.5 years working at the University of Auckland and 2 years working at a private training establishment. I trained as a primary school teacher and I do have an appreciation for education, good education policy, and can differentiate between the two. Mr Speaker, I will start by saying that Labor does support this bill. We agree that it makes some necessary changes to the tertiary education sector. So Mr Peachy, unlike usual, is actually not entirely wrong. However, we do have some reservations, and before I get into those reservations, Mr Speaker, I'd really like to say, before I get into the reservations we have with this bill, having worked in the tertiary sector, I really want to thank the last Labor government. I really want to thank the last Labor government for the funding, for the resourcing that they put into the tertiary sector, for the difference that they made to communities like the Māori and Pacific communities in terms of participation, in terms of completion of higher level tertiary qualifications. I really want to thank the former Labor government for their understanding of the fact that having a highly skilled population was all part of having a successful economy. I really want to thank that former Labor government for being in touch with communities in terms of the value that they place on tertiary education and ensuring that their members of their community got access to quality tertiary education. Now, from there, I want to talk a little bit about what this bill does do well, or the good things in this bill. Now, we do support, as part of this bill, the creation of a new Crown agency to cover export education. We believe it is a vital part of our economy which needs to be properly managed and fostered, so we support that. We perceive the private training industry as an important part of the tertiary sector, and we want to protect their reputation and the subsequent reputation of the wider tertiary sector. Now, in saying that, cases of qualification selling and falsifying results do harm to both. It harms students, it harms the sector. Therefore, the introduction of stricter rules around the registration of private training establishments is welcomed by us. Now, tonight in this House, the public and the other members will hear a great deal on our view that the bill's ability to regulate student levies will be undermined by the voluntary student membership bill, which will subsequently undermine the student voice. This House has been told by my colleague David Shearer that huge levy rises last year were the result of the national government's squeeze on tertiary funding, which is forcing institutions to lay off staff or pass the buck to students. We hope that the national government and the general public has listened to the concerns that David Shearer has raised and that my colleagues will raise when they get to their feet as well. What I really want to discuss is the creation of a new Crown agency to cover export education. As I said, it is a vital part of our economy, and we support the creation of a new Crown agency to cover export education. However, whilst on one hand we have the national government working towards increasing the overseas market for our tertiary education sector, we have the tertiary education minister himself on the other hand saying publicly that we must dampen down the demand for tertiary education here in New Zealand by New Zealanders, by our domestic market. I find it strange that the national government would be all about encouraging international students to come and participate in our tertiary sector when they can't even do the same for students that are here in New Zealand. I think the general public would be concerned at the fact that the national government wants to open it up to the international market but not to the domestic market here. Now, what we're wondering is whether the national government's grand plan is that we run a tertiary education system that largely caters for overseas interests rather than our own. And it kind of sits alongside that whole sell off our state assets subject as well, in terms of our tertiary education here in New Zealand should be about New Zealanders and should be about, first and foremost, making sure that people here in New Zealand have access to high-level, high-quality tertiary education, but they want to sell it off overseas. It's exactly the same as what's happening with our state assets. What we need to keep in mind when we're looking at how the Minister of Tertiary Education has said we want to dampen down the demand for tertiary education here in New Zealand is that what we are seeing is youth joblessness remaining extremely high, with the latest OECD figures showing 1 in every 5 young Kiwis are now out of work. Now, when you look at the statistics for Māori and Pacific, a high proportion since that government came into office of Māori and Pacific students, an unacceptably high number of Māori and Pacific students, are not only not in employment, but are also not engaged in any education. And yet, we have a tertiary education minister that would say publicly, we need to dampen down the demand for tertiary education here. We've seen the national government do things like slash funding to adult community education and night schools by a massive 80%, leading to a trebling in fees and hundreds of courses being shut down. Keep in mind that adult community education is often the first step for many people back into the education system. Stephen Joyce has done little to increase the number of places in universities and polytechs. By refusing to adequately lift the caps on numbers, thousands of students are getting turned away from study each year. Last year we saw Stephen Joyce cut $55 million from industry training funding, which could have provided places for an extra 55,000 trainees which would have been able to fill the looming skills shortage. Not only have we seen decisions made by the Minister of Tertiary Education that make us question how valuable the national government think that tertiary education is for the everyday Kiwi here in New Zealand, but we've even seen changes in our social development policy, which sits alongside that theory with regards to an underappreciation of the importance of high-level tertiary education for New Zealanders. We've seen cuts in the training incentive allowance, which takes away the opportunity for sole parents to get access to tertiary education which would not only benefit them but also their children. We've seen welfare reforms that, from memory, the sole parent would be encouraged to go back and study up to level 3 but not level 4 and beyond, because for some reason or another that wouldn't be of any benefit to them. It is time that the government looked at the solutions used in Australia, for instance, investing heavily in skills training and tertiary education to help young people into long-term work. Instead, this government does nothing but deliver more cuts to the very programs we need. And yet, as I said, with the establishment of the expansion of international education and to safeguard the quality and reputation of the New Zealand education system, we support the promotion of the quality education that we have here to the international student market. But what we don't like seeing is that be done at the expense of ensuring that we have access to quality tertiary education and we promote access to quality tertiary education to our domestic student market. What we're going to see down the track, if this government doesn't get their act together with regards to providing those opportunities, is a very abysmal future for New Zealand. If we don't have our young people getting access to quality tertiary education, then what hope do we have in the future of having a strong economy in this country? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.